I'm very interested in what you touched on, which is kind of like philosophy of mathematics. And it's a big unanswered question and kind of like ongoing discussion that I have with myself and with friends about like the nature of math and the relationship of math with the natural world, and to what extent mathematics is something that's been discovered or something that you're kind of uncovering that's somehow the language of nature. So I think that like Web3 has a lot of potential and there's a lot of good stuff about Web3, but I think it's more in terms of like the ways in which Web3 intersects with self-custody and self-sovereignty in general. But then the current implementation of Web3, which is like browser-based stuff, is really bad. And we see this all the time with like all these hacks and people losing money constantly. It's gone to the degree where people are afraid to actually like sign contracts with their MetaMask because no one knows when they're going to get rugged. It's happening all the time. It's terrifying.
Hello, and welcome back to Eclectic Spacewalk. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay. Today on Conversations, we are joined by Rachel Rose O'Leary. Rachel Rose is a developer at DarkFi, a decentralized and anonymous community creating new technological concepts centered around sovereignty. Rachel Rose's work focuses on privacy, encryption, and anti-fragility. We talked all things cryptocurrency, learning high-level mathematics, surveillance, as well as describing tensions between different web-based design philosophies. We also spoke about how lunarpunk is the next evolution of the solarpunk movement, which came out of the cypherpunk movements of the past decades. Now, before we play the episode, I would ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and reach more people, as well as continue to have more interesting discussions with eclectic guests. Also, tell us in the comments what your favorite part of the talk was and who we should invite on next. Now, on to the discussion. So first and foremost, let's get a sense of, who you are, where you're from. You don't have to get too specific, but, what kind of region of the world do you come from? And, what were your kind of childhood memories of curiosity? That's what I kind of want to question you on, is what were you most curious about growing up?
I'm from Ireland, and I think a big point of curiosity, I was always very interested in the natural world. So a kind of scientific interest in like biology, but also I was very interested when I was younger by the question of like, how did things come to be the way that they are? I remember walking around and being kind of confused like by the buildings and thinking, where did these come from? And like, why do they happen in this way that they are? I couldn't piece together. And even in school, there was, I think increasingly with our generations, but like over time, it kind of gets more intense. It's like there's very streamlined avenues for people that are like set up in school. And I remember feeling like, what is this strange streamlined existence that's been created for us? Like, why do we have to, go to school and then go to college and then do this thing? It all felt very strange to me. So I guess they were the kind of questions I was interested in growing up.
Yeah. And then so what about like naturalism, I guess you could say, out in nature? Was it, just going out and being around nature that kind of got you into those things to the natural world? And then also, like, did you have someone that was maybe pushing these questions of curiosity? Were you reading a lot of books? Where was this kind of inspiration coming from?
Totally. So yeah, I was lucky enough that as a teenager, I was involved in Scouts, which is like you go outside and spend several days camping and hiking. And so, I'm very happy that I had that experience as a teenager, a very healthy one. My family also are all very interested in ecology in the natural world. My mom, she's like an environmental activist. She has instilled in us a love of nature and especially trees that, is really carried down to all of us in the family. But also I'm very much a bookworm. So even when I was young, I was reading books, whatever books I could get my hands on. So books around the house, they weren't always the best books. Sometimes I wish they were better books that I got access to, but just reading anything really. And then as I became a teenager, increasingly, I kind of systematically read all the classics and philosophy books, like kind of getting increasingly sophisticated as the years went by in terms of the reading.
And do any titles stick out to you? Just come to mind as you think about that, like the classics, I guess, or any other ones?
Totally. So like I'm really happy that I had that time, because now in crypto, I think it's true for all of us, like very few people finding the time to read, or if you are reading, it's like maybe textbooks like economics, technology books. But literature, like I still read philosophy, but literature I don't have as much time to read. But like stuff like Dostoevsky, I love the book The Idiot. It's like a big thick book. So that was a book that really interested me. I was also very much into the books of J.D. Salinger. He's an American writer. He did like Franny and Zooey. I think I read those at a similar time. Also classics like the older texts, ancient Greek plays, stuff like Medea, I would highly recommend. Oedipus, those kind of stories, like the old myths. Especially Greek, I was following a lot when I was young, but now I've expanded into other areas of myth as well.
Yeah. And then so what are you reading now? Like what kind of, gets you going and kind of like back to the olden day? I mean, are you reading like sci-fi, fantasy, or like what is on your bookshelf other than crypto business stuff, I guess you could say?
So now I have a rule, self-imposed rule, that I'm not allowed study philosophy until I get better at math. So I'm now mostly reading and practicing math. So that's taking up all my reading time. But before that, I did recently, I was reading a lot of history and some philosophy for an article that I've been writing, which is about, we're going to talk about lunar punk. The article was about like the more, I guess, the metaphysics of lunar punk. So lunar symbolism and like the ancient kind of roots of the vision that lunar punk is proposing.
So one of the things that you just kind of mentioned right there, and I don't want to let it just hang in the air, is the mathematics and philosophy. Can you kind of go deeper into that? Because, and this is, I guess, what I'm thinking it right now is I remember reading a book from Max Tegmark, Our Mathematical Universe, and the idea is that just, everything in our universe is just math. Is that kind of what kind of going down the line of philosophy? Like how, kind of intrigue us here.
I'm very interested in philosophy of technology. So that's been like my kind of niche, but I'm very interested in what you touched on, which is kind of like philosophy of mathematics. And it's a big unanswered question and kind of like ongoing discussion that I have with myself and with friends about like the nature of math and the relationship of math with the natural world, and to what extent mathematics is something that's been discovered or something that you're kind of uncovering, that's somehow the language of nature. And I'm more on the latter side, but I actually think that ontologically, to use like a philosophical term, things can be doubles, like they can be simultaneously two things. So I think maths is both a kind of a game and an artifice, and also something like profoundly natural and part of the natural order. So I think it has these like two faces. It's like a twin, which is really interesting. But in terms of philosophy in general, I guess where I've been reading more is like kind of Spinoza and Deleuze. I've been reading them. I come from philosophically now, and I'm glad we're starting in philosophy. We usually with interviews we don't go this deep so quickly. But I come from a kind of background of I was very interested in a particular philosopher called Nick Land. So I actually wrote a thesis on Nick Land back in 2017. So I come from that kind of Landian school, but then increasingly got these days more into kind of Deleuze and Spinoza, and they're much more mathematical thinkers. Like Spinoza, if you read his book, The Ethics, it's in a very formal way as like almost like a set of mathematical proofs. It's like, he says QED, he's like proving statements and like chaining statements of logic together. But this is like prior to analytic philosophy, so it's like very old school. But he has a beautiful vision of nature and a kind of like an imminent emergent property of nature, which he says is like God. So God is like the sum of all nature and like the emergent properties of nature kind of thing, which I think is really beautiful. And then Deleuze, I met a guy years ago who told me this thing about Deleuze that I'm only now coming back around to. I don't even remember this guy's name, but he was a philosopher, and he said Deleuze deals with mathematics in his work, and a lot of the times people just think it's just like for show or something. But this guy was like, I think that he was onto something mathematically, and that you could actually describe his philosophy using mathematics. He's like an underappreciated mathematician as much as he is a philosopher. And I've been reading Deleuze recently, and I like to have that in mind, because he does often describe things almost in terms of calculus, at least in part of Deleuze that I've been reading recently, which is his writings on Nietzsche. So he's taking Nietzschean ideas and then he's like describing them in mathematical language, talking about like differences, like using like differential equations and stuff. But yeah, I've banned philosophy from my life for now because I have to, like, I love philosophy, it's my passion, but I have to get better at math. And also I'm pretty bad at math. I'm getting better through the study of math, but I do think math is philosophical in its own right. It's like a strange language that gets us closer to the behaviors of nature. And it's very elegant also. And there's some stuff in math which you're like, wait a second, like what is going on here? So I think it's good to have like an intellectual curiosity when it comes to like, why is math so strange and internally consistent and like elegant and poetic? There's some weird stuff going on here. That's like a philosophical line of reasoning as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, then let's philosophize a little bit, just or at least put you on the spot, maybe. Then, so I mean, what do you think? Do you think? Because when you started talking about the going back and forth between it being found and discovered to being like invented, math, but I mean, the immediate first thing was like cycles of paradigm shifts. Is like that we've kind of gone through, one or the other kind of in tandem, or one is more kind of prominent during this century and then another. And then I was immediately thought of like universal constants. I mean, you just talked about weird stuff like why is universal constants the way they are, and then you get into multiverse discussions, about, in another multiverse, the universal constant could be something else or whatever. And then also even things like Fermat's last theorem, for so long it was not. And then Andrew Weil just came across and worked on it for a couple of decades. And then, now we know it. So like, what is kind of your thoughts on that? Maybe we dive just a little bit. We don't have to go head first in, but maybe dip our toes in the philosophizing of mathematics.
So the question is, what is the ontology of math? Like, is it invented or existent? Or is the question, why is math like deeply orderly in this like poetic way? Or which is the question?
Yeah. Well, that I think great response, perfect response for that. So answering with another question and philosophizing, that's perfect. I mean, if you want to go to in any one of those, then fantastic. But honestly, I think it's interesting when you said that you also are just learning more math, and you said you're not maybe the best, but like how exactly. I mean, are you doing that? Like, I mean, 20, some years after school, et cetera. I mean, if I started thinking about doing math right now, I mean, I have enough trouble learning German, and some other things like, how are you going about this? Are you taking like a full systems approach? Are you going into specific fields? Are you working with other mathematicians? Like how exactly are you leveling up in mathematics,
So I'm very lucky in that I have inside a DarkFi, like a community that is a very intellectual community that support each other in like learning and acquiring new skills. But practically then, this is also how I learned programming was in part, through those connections. So that's part of it, but also, so I learned programming as well. My experiences is to completely, I would not recommend that people do like online courses or anything, but just to find like a good book and to use that book. So for example, when I learned programming, I had a book on C++ and I just like kept my computer disconnected from the internet and I just like would go through the book and like compile the examples. Similarly with math. So I do have like a line of specialization, which I'm taking with the math. There's like many different areas that like in which math will be relevant to DarkFi. For example, if I wanted to go down the ZK angle, I would want to be going into algebra, abstract algebra. But then from my side, because I'm more on the token engineering side and the kind of DeFi engineering, that's calculus. So like since the past couple of years, I had a really bad math education. So in the last number of years, I've been just studying like high school textbooks to like get my basic knowledge of like fundamental math higher. And then now from there, kind of specializing more into calculus. And from calculus, like once I finish the self-made calculus course, then from there going into more like systems. And, I have a book on evolutionary biology and I will start making Python scripts to model like the different algorithms, things like the game of life and other kinds of evolutionary biology concepts like the spread of viruses. So you can model this and simulate it in Python.
So what's kind of been your most I don't want to get too cliche, but what's been like kind of the most rewarding, and what's been like the worst part of this this relearning experience? Because I'm assuming there's been many hours at this.
So, most rewarding is how it's fed back into my other kind of technical skills and activities. I come from a non-technical background. I studied art in college, and then I learned programming afterwards. I got pretty decent, but then maths, I think it has helped me like reason about things like technical questions and compartmentalized questions in a way that I wasn't able to do before. So I think it helped train in other ways, but also to understand more like technical schemas. Somehow having a grounding in mathematics has really helped that. Then the least kind of rewarding aspect, I mean, anything is a struggle, or things that are a struggle feel uncomfortable at the time. So I force myself to do math in the evening because I generally work on other stuff in the day. So it's evenings and afternoons I do study, and that's not great. And oftentimes I'd much rather be reading philosophy. And also with philosophy, it's like, because I've been doing that for much longer, there's an immediacy where I'm like, I can engage with it much more readily, and I feel like I'm growing and, I'm expanding my knowledge. Whereas in math, it can often feel a bit like it's just like a struggle. But then you get to there's like a tipping point in your own skills where suddenly it's like a downhill slope, and acquiring new skills becomes increasingly easy. So I've been through that with programming before, where like initially it's like this like very difficult, very cumbersome and like painful task, but you just like keep chipping through, and eventually it becomes easy.
It's like you said, in the time when you're doing them, maybe not so much, but like the reward afterwards, when you learn calculus, I mean, I'm assuming that's going to be awesome and very helpful. So I guess switching a little bit, or not switch. I mean, I think we kind of need to ground ourselves a little bit before we kind of get into some more questions. But I guess as a starting point, like, when did you first hear about cryptocurrency? Kind of like any type of online, money or anything like that? Like what were kind of the early days of your experience with kind of online cash, those kind of things?
I would say I was very sheltered from it until about 2015. And actually my entire life until that point had been fairly sheltered from technology in general, in that I was in art college and I was mainly doing like studio practice of like making physical artworks. So in and around 2015, that completely broke down. And I started to get like increasingly into digital art at the time, and also Bitcoin, peer-to-peer technologies, encryption, the cypherpunk movement, that kind of like entered my life in 2015. And part of that was to do with a friend at the time who's still a good friend. His name is Paul Dillon Ennis. He's a crypto researcher and philosopher as well. And he gave me a book by Julian Assange called Cypherpunks and the Freedom of the Internet. And I read that book, and it basically clued me up that my experience with technology up until that point had been extremely naive, and that I hadn't even realized that I was like being surveilled in this increasingly sinister way. And in the introduction, so the book it's good, it's like interviews with Assange, but the beginning of the book is a kind of manifesto, which I highly recommend. It's just an introduction, and he basically says he's speaking from the perspective of an enemy of the state. So he's like, things are really bad, and I know they're bad because I am like facing the enemy head on. And he basically says technology has unfolded into two fundamental types. Like, one is surveillance based and it's about control, and the other is about freedom and it's based on encryption. That really struck me at the time. There's a beautiful quote from that which says, "The universe smiles on encryption." And he talks about like how by some weird property of the universe, it's easier to encrypt things than it is to decrypt them. So it's like the universe is on our side when it comes to encryption technologies. So in a weird way, the universe is on the side of freedom, which I thought was a really powerful concept. And the rest of the interviews, etc., they discuss Bitcoin, PGP, cypherpunk movement, etc. So that's where I entered. And for like a few years, I was making very primitive form of crypto art, which did not involve NFTs, although I wish it did, because like a lot of those early NFTs pumped. So it didn't involve NFTs, it just involves like some weird kind of conceptual stuff. But then at around 2016, 2017, I finally left the art world behind and like became like full-time crypto.
And then, so, I mean, it's funny that because around 2015, that's also when I got introduced to the space. I think I bought my first Bitcoin. I think, yeah, it was a Christmas present to myself for, $215 or something like that. So it's been a wild ride, as a holder, but I've also used that for back in the day. I was using it like in Los Angeles for like coffees and like a massage and stuff like that. So wild, like use cases. But then also I think one of the things that we are synonymous with this as well is I was very familiar with the work of the documentary filmmaker Alex Winter, and he did the documentary Deep Web and basically talked about everything around, Bitcoin, the Silk Road, and, the state agencies, being involved at every level. But then also before that, this tragic case of Aaron Swartz, the co-founder of Reddit, those were big life moments for me as well. And so I guess let's just kind of go through some of this evolutions of the crypto space. You mentioned, early adopters, then we go through like ICOs and, NFTs and all-time highs. And then we have a huge crash. And then you have, the FTX scandal, but then also Ethereum 2.0, and then you have DarkFi. So there's a huge, space that's out there. But how is it out there? Why is there something that's needed, something like digital money, And so when you were talking about some type of thing, the biggest thing to make it easier for someone is that I could encrypt, I could safely send you some type of value, or anyone in the world, some type of value. That was kind of the idea. But then as we've seen, the use cases and the adoption rate hasn't exactly been, at escape level. So I guess let's just talk about like, how were you going through all this stuff from 2016 on? What was kind of your trajectory, your experience, and then we'll kind of get to where you are now at DarkFi, and then we can go into Lunar Punk and stuff like that after.
When I first came into the space, I was writing for a very obscure blog that was a mix of like philosophy and technology. So I was writing from the perspective of like Bitcoin and Ethereum had just been launched at that time, are the kind of like the technical articulation of a philosophical system. And what's interesting about them is that they're not representative in the way that art is. They're like actually practical and building things in the world. There's this like amazing continuity between the ideological conceptual layer and the actual implementation in code. That's where I first was like writing. But then, I left college and I joined CoinDesk in 2017. That was a really good grounding experience because I had come from an art background and like, philosophy and all this like highbrow stuff. CoinDesk taught me like how to write for everyone in a way that's like highly accessible and to not like overcomplicate things. I often have that war with myself to speak simply, but CoinDesk taught me how to speak simply. And also I was going to many conferences. So I started off writing about news, and then I specialized on Ethereum, then increasingly kind of privacy tech. So I was able to go to all the ETH conferences and all the privacy conferences. I went to like the first Zcash conference. Yeah, it was amazing as an experience, but it was also very frustrating because I had come from this context of like being interested in crypto because I felt it was like the fulfillment of some cypherpunk vision. But then I found in reality, when I was going around to conferences, that these two things were kind of at odds with each other. So like, while there was this like amazing richness in the cypherpunk kind of vision, the actual space seemed very limited in that way, and it seemed mostly about making money. That was a bit of a surprise and a bit of a disappointment to find that these two things were at odds with each other. In Ethereum, I felt like there was much more people who seemed to be genuinely interested in making an impact beyond making money. However, they had also largely deviated from like the privacy narrative. So it was all about transparency. There was very little questioning around privacy. And I remember going to conferences where they would have people talking about tokenization, and they would say like, oh, we can tokenize our family tree, and we can, have biometrics on the blockchain where we can unlock a car like with a smart contract and using biometrics or something. I was like, wait, what? Like this sounded really bad. And I was like, why are people thinking this way? Coming from this experience where I thought crypto was good because of cypherpunk and because of encryption and all that stuff and the freedom technologies. And then I saw in practice that it's kind of corrupted in that way. So I became increasingly interested in something like ETH, which is programmable, but that has privacy and anonymity. So at one point I actually wanted to leave CoinDesk to work on that. I was like, didn't have the technical skills at all, but I just had the will and the inclination toward like a anonymous, like programmable blockchain. But then in the end, I didn't, but I did increasingly kind of start writing on privacy. And in 2018, I interviewed Amir, who's co-founder with DarkFi. He was one of the first 5 Bitcoin developers, and he wrote Dark Wallet, which was the first anonymous Bitcoin wallet using CoinJoin back in 2013. So I met him in 2018. He's old school in the privacy space. So I met him back in 2018, and he convinced me to leave CoinDesk and become a programmer, which I did. So that's a little bit. And then since I was in Syria then for like the year 2019, and then I came back, and since then have been building DarkFi with a few others.
That's awesome. Well, it seems like you've had many ups and downs. You've had some dip in the mainstream. I mean, working at CoinDesk, probably pumping out some of those stories. Let's play a little game of word association. I've never really done this, but like I've had so many of these words, and these buzzwords that I kind of wanted you to define for the audience, but at the same time, like they kind of know what it is, and we don't need to kind of handhold them, right? So let's just do some word association and just not just one word, but anything, a phrase, a sentence, whatever. And then, I mean, I have like 8 of them or something, and then we'll move on. Okay. So what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear Web3?
I don't know if you've heard the term like soy, like a soy dev.
Soy dev? No, I've heard like soy boys or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, because like so Web3 is like DarkFi in general, we take issue with the web, like the browser-based paradigm.
Yep.
So I think that like Web3, it has a lot of potential, and there's a lot of good stuff about Web3. But I think it's more in terms of like the ways in which Web3 intersects with self-custody and self-sovereignty in general. But then the current implementation of Web3, which is like browser-based stuff, is really bad. And we see this all the time with like all these hacks and people losing money constantly. It's gone to the degree where people are afraid to actually like sign contracts with their MetaMask because no one knows when they're going to get rugged. It's happening all the time. It's terrifying. So, a lot of this is bad engineering that comes from like the web development paradigm, which is why I call it soy. This is like a bad developer paradigm, which is about like abstraction and stuff like just dragging in loads of code that you don't understand, and not having this like step-by-step approach, like simplicity oriented approach to engineering, which I think is really important. And it's also where like DarkFi is distinguishing itself, because we have a very strong software philosophy, which is about simplicity. And we want to move away from the web to create a kind of like underweb, or like a non-web or a dark web, some kind of, we don't know the word for it yet, some kind of
an emerging web.
Unweb. Yeah, exactly. Which would be more like in the line of anonymity and self-sovereignty. So we're talking like desktop apps that are connecting to each other on a peer-to-peer network, and eventually mobile apps as well. But that's like a little bit further down the line.
So go into one of these, sovereignty, and then I guess the next one would be self-sovereignty. Like what does that mean to you? And because I know you mentioned it a couple of times, and obviously it comes up in the DarkFi manifesto a bunch of times, et cetera.
A related term is autonomy. So like autonomy, my understanding of this term is also informed of the work of Abdullah Öcalan, who we didn't talk about yet, but he's another philosopher. He's actually a guerrilla who became a philosopher from prison.
Oh,
and
wow.
He has a really interesting perspective, because it's rooted in practice and his experience of creating self-sovereign communities. Like essentially he's Kurdish, and he's part of the Kurdish freedom movement. So self-sovereignty for them, means like the freedom to exist as a culture, but it also goes beyond simple like self-existence to this idea of like self-becoming. So like actually like defining your own destiny beyond the confines of like the coercive structures that you may be contained within. In the case of Rojava and the Kurdish people, it's like how to define a new destiny beyond the paradigm that has been imposed on them, which is the nation state paradigm, very much embodied by Turkey as like this like oppressive, homogenizing force that wants to deny the Kurdish identity. So in that case, like sovereignty and autonomy is like speaking your own language, but also defining your own morals and your own politics that like come from within your community and society, and they're not like imposed on you by some external force.
That's a good way to put it. And I like the practical use case. I'll definitely have to look into that. So next one, anonymous, anonymity, all those things with like kind of being anonymous. And then why is that kind of important on the web or not? You know, kind of, or maybe what are some of the use cases for wanting anonymous or anonymity and maybe not, you know?
Yeah, so the word is obviously forest. So I see anonymity as a forest because it protects people. And it's not only is it protective, but it's also like it gives people the structure to achieve that sovereignty that we just discussed. So like I believe that without anonymity, self-sovereignty isn't possible because communities are ultimately restricted by the fact that their operations are public. So, you know, when we talk about a forest, it's defensive. Like you can imagine, the example I always give is from history. So in Ireland, there were several attempts at colonization by Britain. The first major one, was unsuccessful. So this is the Anglo-Norman invasion. And it originally was successful. They managed to occupy like most of the country, but 100 years later, the traces of the invasion had become invisible. It was like nothing had happened. And the invaders, the people who came, had basically become Irish. They had been like absorbed into the indigenous fabric. And a big part of the reason why was that Ireland was covered in forest. So it made it very difficult against an enemy that knew the landscape and that could, you know, like work with these trees as like a natural form of encryption. It became very, very difficult to establish a military superiority there. But there was also other kinds of foresting that was around. So the Irish was like the only language, the law. So the indigenous, this before the indigenous law, the legal system, which is an anarchistic, non-state legal system that was practiced in Ireland before colonization. So that was still in practice. So these factors contributed to its defenses. And so in the same way, encryption is defensive, but then, you know, it's also like the other metaphor of the forest is not just that it protects, but that it's like a fertile space where things can grow. So this is why I see anonymity as generative, because it allows communities to form in this divergent way where they're free to express their own morals and their own politics.
And then so last one, because we'll kind of keep it at 4 out of the 8 or something. Encryption. You mentioned it before. How important is encryption? What are some? I mean, you don't have to go too deep on like what, you know, how you can encrypt and stuff, but like why is that important philosophically? And then why is that important to then actually have practical use cases?
I'll bring up again that Assange quote, like the universe smiles on encryption. So it's like, I think the modus operandus, I don't know how to say that, the methods of the cypherpunks are as follows. The state is building increasingly complex top down and like all encompassing surveillance machines, but cypherpunks use like simple techniques to render them futile. So encryption is something like this. It's like we can use simple tricks that are inherent in nature and like part of mathematics to create these like amazing self-sovereign and unstoppable architectures. So, you know, I think that that's what's interesting about encryption. It's like one of these mathematical phenomena that is like exists with us as part of our toolkit that enables this like whole range of freedom enforcing technologies. There's a great quote by William Burroughs where he says, this world like is about war and games. I don't know if you've seen that quote. He says, there may be other universes with their own logics, but this one is based on war and games. I always think it's kind of like war and games and encryption, you know, right. In the mix.
You just add that at the end.
yeah, exactly. Or like maybe encryption is like a tactic of war, or maybe it's a game, I don't know.
Sure.
But so yeah, and then practically speaking, that is the basis of how we do with DarkFi. So DarkFi is interesting because it's not just like Ethereum is a completely generic L1. in the sense it is generic and programmable. It's non-opinionated. It doesn't like force people into certain kinds of engineering. However, we're really conceptualizing this new space that we call anonymous engineering, which is, it's not just zero knowledge, but zero knowledge is a component of that. So it's like, basically there's like a set of tricks that we have like within our toolkit that we can combine together to create anonymous applications. So DarkFi is basically providing some kind of interface to that to allow developers to assemble anonymous apps using these different tricks and different like games that we play with encryption. So yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and so I mean, big differences from DeFi, decentralized finance, to then DarkFi. So in your manifesto or for DarkFi, it says sovereign, quote, in the open air of a fully dark anonymous system, cryptocurrency has the potential to birth new technological concepts centered around sovereignty. This can be a creative, regenerative space, the dawn of a dark renaissance. And also, what I also like is anonymity as a design space has been hitherto unexplored. And so DarkFi is blowing the door to this wide open. Very ambitious, big fan, of the idea. But talk us kind of through like how, we get to now, and then what is kind of the future? Like, how are we moving in towards more of a DarkFi space, or we were talking about that emerging web? Is it because like we're going to get into your essay here in a second, and I think I'll kind of tease it with this is two of the main things that kind of you say in your essay is the biggest thing that you have to deal with is this double-edged sword of anonymity and surveillance, and then also it's a basic question of user empowerment with system anti-fragility or fragility. And that's kind of like the nexus of all these things. But then on top of all of that, there's this kind of regulatory trap that, the systems and powers and institutions that be, they want to keep power, they want to continue with things. And the only thing they really have is a hammer of a regulatory trap. But then you say that there's, a rising political consciousness, the center is being eliminated. And then also there's better yield in towards this kind of lunar punk kind of ideas when you really take surveillance seriously and work against that with encryption. But then also, the real thing I think is privacy is like just the main thing in sovereignty. So I know that's a little long-winded, but like, can you just kind of talk us through like the evolution of DarkFi, and then what is kind of in the future for this, and how are you going to distinguish from NFT and ICO hype, and those kind of things?
I will give like a quick kind of overview of where we're at with DarkFi, and then where we're going. So currently we are on testnet. It's a alpha testnet, so that's our first testnet. And on there we have a blockchain which is using something called Ouroboros Crypsinus. So it's an anonymous proof of stake method, which allows for anonymous leader selection. What that means is basically it's nice. It doesn't suffer for the same DDoS vulnerability as I believe Ethereum and Solana have. And also it's censorship resistant and MIV proof. So there is no MEV on DarkFi. Then alongside that blockchain, we have this general purpose smart contract architecture, which involves like several components. There's one component which is like for zero knowledge, creating the circuits that we will use in applications. And then there's another which is like the smart contract layer. For that, we use WASM. And, we combine these things. We have currently on DarkFi running several applications. So we have anonymous transactions. These are all using the smart contract architecture. So there's anonymous transactions working, anonymous swaps. They're like an OTC atomic swap that are enabled between any currencies on DarkFi. Then we have anonymous staking and unstaking is available. Finally, the anonymous DAO, which is like the biggest innovation so far. So that's like a fully anonymous DAO. It's the world's first anonymous DAO, and it's working on the testnet. The cool thing, I spoke with someone recently who described it as the most basic DAO primitive, like the distilled DAO. It's a very like simple concept of what a DAO is, but it's very powerful. And what it allows also at the DarkFi side is like on-chain liquidity that can be programmed according to like a logic of a program. So you could use it to engineer any kind of application that requires a concept of like protocol owned liquidity. So like a collectively owned treasury that can be operated according to rules that are set by the treasury. So that's pretty powerful, and it's anonymous. Then, so like we have ZK as a design space is very new. People haven't properly developed the conceptual side of like that paradigm. So you mentioned paradigm shifts, like we're right at the beginning of a new one. And so we're still forming the conceptual basis for this thing. There are some other projects doing like ZKL1s, but they're, in my opinion, they're like rushing into abstractions, and they're not taking the time to really conceptualize what is this new paradigm, and like what are the fundamental techniques, like the patterns that we can abstract away from this. So we're in the process of conceptualizing that, and the way that we conceptualize it is through application design. So we've built these apps so far. We are also working on NFTs. You mentioned NFTs in a kind of dismissive way, and like I'm also but they're interesting in their own right. And so we're building support for them. Then like where things get a little bit trickier and where we're forced to expand our toolkit is like if you want to do something like a AMM. You cannot do an AMM as it exists on ETH. You cannot just like copy paste that over and it be anonymous. So that requires like reconceptualization of the underlying protocol. That's what we mean when we talk about anonymous engineering. The way that we empower the anonymous engineer is like, I mentioned it's not just ZK. Like we have this SDK, which we will continuously add like more techniques to. So the anonymous engineer can like select from all these different tools, like for example ZK, but also multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, other techniques. In DarkFi, in other areas, we use like Pedersen commitments. So like assembling these to create these applications. But DarkFi itself, you know, the DAO was an important tool because it was informed by our experience with the Assange DAO, which several in DarkFi were involved in. So we raised over 50 million last year to free Assange by all means necessary, which was like, that was our mission statement, free Assange by all means necessary. But then like when it came to it in practice, that was very hard to do because of the fact that we are operating publicly on Ethereum. And also, so we are very restricted in terms of our operation, but also when it came to the actual auction. So we were involved in an auction for an NFT as part of the DAO. The issue is that our treasury size was known publicly. So everyone knew our max bid, which basically broke the mechanics of the auction. No one would bid against us. So like in this way, we think that anonymity as like a variable massively expands the design space of financial engineering. We believe that anonymity is necessary, not just for human freedom, but also for markets to function properly and for game theory to work. So we expect that like, yeah, we want to expand that design space, specifically in the financial side. Like we're interested in self-sovereign communities, which are like financially strong. And like, it's something that we notice is that Ethereum has been managed to enrich itself a lot, like through the community and through the innovations that have happened, like the DAOs, the DeFi, you know, everything that's happened on ETH. But we see that in a lot of the cypherpunk communities, there's a lot of ideological people, but they haven't been able to capture the value that they contribute to the space. So we want to change that. We want a new paradigm of anonymous DAOs to flourish and to allow like free software communities to really capture the value that they create.
Yeah, funny story about knowing max bids. I actually put some stuff, or not that much. I think it was like 20 or 30 bucks into the Constitution DAO to try and buy the Constitution, and then that's the same thing. The bid is public. You know how much the whole DAO has, and so that was an interesting kind of little fun experiment of losing, you know, $25 or whatever. But it was fun. Like it was a zeitgeist kind of moment because like I mean. The fever pitch of those couple of days was really incredible. And then going on Discord and everyone's kind of joined in on this one purpose like that. There was something about that for sure. But I guess let's kind of transition into kind of these paradigm shifts a little bit more. About just over a year ago, you wrote an amazing article, amazing essay that I read and was kind of, I don't know if it went viral per se, but at least in my community, a lot of people were sharing it. Lunar Punk and the dark side of the cycle. We kind of teased out a little bit of these stuff, but I guess to ground us even more is that to recap is, you know, cyberpunk visions against, you know, totalitarian dystopia, et cetera, is using the things that you have at your toolkit, to subvert and kind of play guerrilla warfare tactics, if you will, against the powers that be. And then we have this kind of new thing come in, cryptocurrency, et cetera. But then it has a design philosophy that's very akin to solar punk, which is very bright and optimistic and whatever. I wouldn't say utopic, but trending towards that direction a little bit more. And then lastly, you brought in this idea of the lunar punk, that we really have to kind of take in the unconscious if we're going to put on our our Jungian hats. We're gonna have to really deal with the unconscious. So and I'll read you one quote from your essay, and then I'll let you kind of just go to the races. Quote: "Solar punk is crypto's conscious mind. It is bright, self-confident, and future-oriented. Yet the counterpart to solar punk faith is lunar punk skepticism. Lunar punks are the solar shadow self. They are the unconscious of this cycle, while, quote, solar punks join DAOs," from your friend researcher Dylan Ennis. "Lunar punks are preparing for war and building privacy enhanced tooling to protect their communities." And I think that's super, super interesting, because I also am very involved in this other kind of space with the doomer optimism and bioregionalism, and how basically bioregions are really the kind of political, I guess you could say, substrate, because nation states now, the idea of that in 2023 is bunk. So I really enjoy the potentiality of this stuff, but then how do we get from lunar punk kind of applications other than DarkFi? I guess what is this next phase? What is these new financial kind of applications and things like that? And you started to go into that, but tell us how important lunar punk is, how important it is to kind of be skeptical about solar punk and then traditional mainstream crypto, and away we go.
Perfect. Yeah, so it's interesting because I put out this thesis. It's done, as you said, it was somewhat viral. People were sharing it around in certain communities. It's been interesting because it hasn't exactly been treated in the way I see a lot of people kind of using it for their own purposes. That's fine. That's what it should. That's how it should be. It's like a meme. It gets circulated around. But so it's been used a lot by different groups. Like one side is like actually cypherpunks who are rebranding to lunar punk. Is kind of like a funny dynamic. But
do they
then
just skip solar punk though? Do they just like leapfrog solar punk?
I think interestingly, a lot of the cypherpunks, some of them at least, they're not against solar punk, but they also, as cypherpunks, they understand the critique of lunar punk. And I guess one thing that is very easy to understand about lunar punk is just like in terms of the visuals, is like, oh, it's a point about privacy. And I think that is like fundamentally what, at least in that article, how it was framed, is like about privacy. But it also contains a kind of critique of both solar punks and also cypherpunk. So it's kind of, actually, a friend described it really nicely, a kind of synthesis of the solar punk with the cypherpunk is kind of the lunar punk, because it combines elements of both. But it has a critique of them in that, the critique of cypherpunk is basically that it's still fundamentally anti-state. And so lunar punk is very much trying to be like a non-state, which means like moving beyond this like reactionary kind of dialectical relation with the state, which we see a lot in the cypherpunk aesthetic, where everything is very negative. We see it's a lot, oftentimes you see, even DarkFi, you see like inverted symbols, and even notions of like parallelism. So it's like this, and like subculture, underground. There's a lot of this like of these kind of negational tactics, which I think are good to some degree. But then we have to keep in mind what Nietzsche warns us about when he talks about slave morality, where he says that basically copying the morality that's been imposed on you by the master, but you're flipping it and you're saying, oh, I'm not that, I'm the other thing. But you haven't actually managed to escape that dialectic. So you're still like constrained. So really what Lunapunk wants to do is to like carve out a new path beyond the confines of like the state-based society, and to establish a non-state which is like transcended this dialectic, which lunar or solar punk, which it's, some of the solar punks are into like prefiguration and using these like positive visions to like create a future, to kind of conjure that future into being, like through that mimetic activity of describing the future. So lunar punk will be closer to that, but it's also critical in that solar punk, as it has emerged in ETH, does come with like a lot of naivety, specifically when it comes to the design choices, like the software design choices.
Yeah.
So part of that is transparency, but it's also more, I think it's also broader than that. It also connects to like decentralization, to notions of sovereignty. For example, in Ethereum, a lot of the apps which are web-based, they're using centralized front ends. A lot of those, they link up to things like Cloudflare, which are, they're basically dragging in a lot of surveillance tech, a lot of proprietary surveillance technology. And also, in general, there's like a tendency in ETH where there's this like strong concept of identity, where a lot of the solarpunk apps, such as quadratic voting, require strong concepts of identity. Lunarpunk is moving away from that. It's more into anonymity and like even pluralistic identities, or like having weak concepts of identities. And again, because we believe that anonymity is like a generative space, it's a garden, it's a forest, it's a creative space of potentiality. So Lunarpunk is really like about defining these new futures beyond the confines of the surveillance state and allowing anonymity to be like a fertilizer for these new non-state spaces. So that's like a quick synopsis.
No, that's great. And then, so, I mean, going into a little deeper, so just to kind of some bullet points, things about lunar tech would be it's owned and operated by the people, basically in service of themselves. The difference is nurtured and protected. But I think one of the biggest things is, quote, the lunar cycle upholds democratic techniques against authoritarian technology, freedom against surveillance, and diversity against monoculture. Now, through that, I think you make a very specific, you thread the needle of exactly what's happening, is that transparency is a double-edged sword in a lot of different ways. Is that, in like a lot of different places in common parlance and social spaces, you would just say, hey, increase the transparency. That's ultimately a good thing. But then, as you're saying, is that when you increase transparency, you also kind of put on an academic hat of like, what is measured is surveilled. Well, what is kind of transparent? Well, then that obviously makes it easier to surveil. And then that also gets used as a cudgel or a tool for authoritarianism. And so kind of you make this distinction that, solar punk and then traditional cryptocurrency is kind of stuck in this transparency is always good. And then that just means more surveillance. And then now what kind of you're saying is that, well, if you flip it all completely on its head and then there's no transparency of anything, well, then it's more, like you say, a generative space to create other things. How do we think about transparency and permissionlessness and decentralization when some of those things are inherently thought of as good things, but then they have second, third, fourth order knock-on effects? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Something that I like about the moon as a symbol is like, it doesn't imply darkness. It implies light, actually, but like somehow a limited form of light, or like a controlled form of light. So in Irish, the Irish for moon is Galach, and that means brightness. And what's interesting is that word is a euphemism, because in ancient Ireland, the moon was a very important deity. And with deities, it's like in a lot of spiritual cultures, it's considered like bad luck to refer to the deity directly. So the Irish for moon, which is Galach, is not the true name of the moon. It's like a euphemism for the moon that has been passed down in time, but the euphemism is brightness, which I think is very nice. And it's relevant here because what these new technologies, these encryption techniques allow is to not think in black and white terms of either everything is transparent or everything is anonymous. It's like you can actually have partially encrypted programs, which is much more powerful, because like you could, for example, as a DAO, decide that actually for our use case, depending on our threat model, depending on, whatever, the needs of the DAO, we could choose to reveal certain actions. Mm-hmm. Like we could, for example, make our treasury public, but protect all of the DAO members. Or, we could keep everything anonymous, but maybe there's a particular transaction that we want to reveal on chain. So with these new primitives, we have that optionality and that choice where we can selectively reveal things. And I think that's a better paradigm than the one that we have now, which is like everything either like in the blockchain level, like on Ethereum currently, everything is forced to be transparent, or the other side is like the big tech transparency, which is like, okay, it's private for most people, but on the back end, it's all surveilled like by governments and by big tech. Yep. But like the people can't see. So yep. Like in a weird way, Ethereum is more pure, it's more democratic to have everyone have access to all the info, but it's an issue that this is like forced and that it's in all cases true. So that's a bit the correction, I guess, that Lunapunk wants to make.
The word that keeps coming up to mind when you keep talking about this is obviously we're in a new paradigm, and the things are maturing, things are growing, but I guess the base layer is just now coming into fruition, really. And it seems to me like there's a lot of potentiality, like you said. Talk about that, because I think you just started to go on that of the partiality of like, okay, well, some parts could be this and some parts could be not. But then if you start really thinking about the possibilities, then all of a sudden there's a whole ecosystem that could come out of this immediately. So what's kind of what needs to happen for that ecosystem to kind of come up? I mean, because the CIA and the NSA are not going to stop spying tomorrow, or the GHQ, or any of the big five spying eyes and institutions and powers that be. So what are some other things that we as consumers or regions or collected social networks do about this going forward?
I think something you touched on is like gets to a question that I find very compelling, which is like, what are the potential tools that can be built through ZK that otherwise wouldn't be possible? Like, what are the tools that like right now couldn't exist, but now can exist? And I think the kind of interaction that we're having now is a bit like a transformative contact. So one of my favorite things in science fiction, the moment where a society has contact with the horizons of the possible. So you can think about it like in Expanse, when they make contact with the ring, there's like many times in many films, there's like a fundamental pattern in sci-fi, which is like this transformative contact where the space of potentiality, as you've spoken, just gets completely reconfigured by the introduction of this new thing. And I think now at the moment, the new thing, it has been crypto, and now the new thing that's like reconfiguring the future is anonymous technologies, zero knowledge encryption, and the like not just ZK, but like the whole toolkit of cryptographic operations that we can use to create anonymous applications. But we're really at the beginning. It's like, so I see it as like an alien techniques, a xenotechnics. We're very much at the beginning of conceptualizing this space. So, from the DarkFi side, we're trying to, at the moment, the way that we've designed DarkFi is to be intentionally simple, but as we build applications, we observe common patterns that developers use. Like, for example, one pattern is like, you can do this in ZK, it's called a Merkle inclusion proof, or like some kind of a membership proof. So it's basically saying you can prove something exists within a set without revealing that thing. So anonymously say whether or not something happened on chain, for example. So this is like a primitive, and there's many such kind of tricks, and we will slowly build abstractions around this. And that will serve as the basis of a toolkit that we can develop software using. So like, again, because we're so early stage, we haven't really fleshed out like, what are these new alien techniques? And we're still kind of in the stage of like, okay, like there's DAOs on ETH, like this is how DAOs would be in an anonymous way, like NFTs, like we're still in that like transitioning phase. But for example, you could build stuff like anonymous liquidation markets, like using MPC, where you don't know people's balances, but you can still liquidate them using multi-party computation. That could be used for a DEX as like a component within a DEX. You'd also do like incentivized anonymous leaking, information leaks. You could do anonymous buy and sell marketplaces. You can do incentivized information. You can prove that you own a piece of information without revealing that information. There's many ideas, but we're still early stage. Personally, like my creative power is being diverted towards like actually building the most basic tools. So we haven't gotten deep into the conceptualization stage, but that's a really exciting area as well.
No, definitely exciting times that we live in. So last question to get you out of here. I ask everyone this. The overview effect is kind of when astronauts go up into space and see the Earth from either low Earth orbit or from the moon, et cetera, and have this kind of transformative experience. I'm doing some research into critiquing this idea, but then at the same time, I also want to ask kind of guests like what their thoughts on, seeing the Earth from space, what kind of would they think about? I've had responses from, reading a poem to nothing and just enjoying it to, waxing poetically about, things that they want to see in the world, et cetera. So what would Rachel Rose O'Leary say when she goes up to space and sees the Earth? Would you stay on the moon?
Oh, well, yeah, I would absolutely love to go into space. I wouldn't just stay on the moon. I would totally travel around. Like, I think that would be amazing, and I would do that in a heartbeat. But I think in terms of the effect, I think it's really interesting, kind of decentering. So like we see that when the pale blue dot, like there's that
Yep.
famous cover where we saw Earth for the first time far away, and it kind of corresponded with this general awareness that actually the downstream effect of the Copernican revolution, where Copernicus popularized the idea that no, the Earth was not at the center of the universe. Actually, we're just one of many planets which orbits around the sun. And there was this like big decentering of the human from the sciences that happened around this time. And it's been like steadily kind of progressing ever since, where humans are like, there's like this humbling experience of realizing, we're actually quite a small part of like much bigger, greater systems. Like, for example, did you know that ants, like the insect, compose 20% of all biomass on Earth?
Okay, yeah, I have heard
It's
these like little
what
crazy
the
facts.
fuck? Yeah, like 20%, that's insane. Whereas like humans are less than 1%. So that's huge. Like actually it's an ant world, it's not a human world. So these kind of decenterings are really interesting. And then just to like wrap up quickly, there's another philosopher that I really like called Ray Brazier, and he writes a book called Nihil Unbound, which is about nihilism, but he takes nihilism in a really nice creative direction, where it's kind of like, the Carl Sagan quote, "We are the custodians of life's meaning." Yeah, so he takes that notion and he basically brings thought to its limits. So he says like, how are we supposed to deal with the fact that not just like that, humans will eventually go extinct, but also the fact that like the sun is going to burn out, and like, the universe is going to disintegrate into like, was it called? There's a particular.
Yeah, it's like a great squeeze or a great push, whatever.
Yeah,
whichever
exactly.
One.
But anyway, so there's like this heat death like horizon which we have to reckon with, and so he's like, how are we supposed to do with this? He uses it as a basis of a very uplifting thought, which is like, actually anything is possible, and we are the custodians of life's meaning. That means we create the meaning ourselves. And in a similar way, it's nihilistic to think that there is no end goal. Things will like tend towards extinction. And yet that's an empowering thought, because it means like that the potential lies within us. So I guess that's what I would say from the moon, the standpoint of the moon.
No, that's great. I mean, decentering, always good to do. And then anytime quoting Carl Sagan is okay in our books. So, well, thank you so much for such a great conversation, Rachel Rose O'Leary. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on Conversations.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much to Rachel Rose O'Leary. She and DarkFi have proven that they are truly committed to designing and building web architectures that are based on anonymity and privacy. We wish them great success and can't wait for the creation of a real anonymous and web-based ecosystem of applications. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Now, before we go, please like this video if you found the discussion generative and intriguing. Leave a comment about your favorite part of the episode or who we should interview next, and subscribe for more eclectic content. Until next time, Ad Astra.